I never thought silence could be so loud until I became the keeper of my family's darkest secret. My name is Sarah, and at 16 I discovered something that would shatter everything I believed about the people I loved most. It started with a photograph tucked behind a loose floorboard in my grandmother's attic. A photograph that shouldn't have existed, featuring faces that told a story decades in the making. The summer of 2019 was supposed to be ordinary. I was staying with Grandma Rose while my parents traveled through Europe, celebrating their 20th wedding anniversary. Rose's Victorian house always felt like a museum to me, filled with antiques and memories from a time I couldn't quite grasp. But that particular July afternoon, while helping her organize old boxes for donation, I stumbled upon something that would change our family forever. The floorboard creaked differently under my weight, and when I pressed down it gave way slightly. Curiosity got the better of me, a trait that ran in our family, though I would soon learn it wasn't always a blessing. Beneath the loose board was a small metal box, tarnished with age but still intact. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a photograph dated 1952. The black and white image showed a young woman holding a baby, standing next to a man in military uniform. But it wasn't just any woman. It was unmistakably my grandmother, though decades younger. The shocking part wasn't her youth, but the date on the back of the photo and what it meant. According to everything I'd been told, Grandma Rose had married Grandpa Henry in 1955, and my father wasn't born until 1958. Yet here was evidence of a life that predated the story our family had lived by. My hands trembled as I studied the photograph more closely. The man in uniform wasn't my grandfather. His features were sharper, his build different. And the baby in my grandmother's arms looked remarkably like the childhood photos I'd seen of my father. The implications sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the dusty attic air. I sat there for what felt like hours, turning the photograph over and over, hoping the date would somehow change or that I'd misunderstood something fundamental. But the evidence was clear. My grandmother had been living a lie for over 60 years, and somehow, that lie had become the foundation upon which our entire family was built. The sound of Rose calling me for dinner broke through my thoughts. I carefully rewrapped the photograph and placed it back in the box, but I couldn't bring myself to put it back under the floorboard. Instead, I slipped it into my backpack, knowing that this moment marked the end of my childhood innocence and the beginning of something far more complicated. That night at dinner, I watched my grandmother differently. Every gesture, every story she told, every laugh felt layered with deception. She seemed smaller somehow, more fragile, as if the weight of whatever secret she was carrying had finally become visible to me. I wanted to confront her immediately, to demand the truth, but something in her tired eyes stopped me. There was a sadness there I'd never noticed before, the kind that comes from carrying a burden alone for too long. Instead, I excused myself early and spent the night researching everything I could about the photograph. The military uniform suggested World War II or Korean War era, and the photography style was consistent with the early 1950s. But it was the name written faintly on the back that made my blood run cold. James and Rose with little Tommy. Tommy was my father's name, Thomas, though everyone called him Tom now. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of my grandmother's guest room, I realized I was now part of a conspiracy I never asked to join. The knowledge felt heavy in my chest, like a stone I couldn't swallow. I had become the unwilling guardian of a truth that could destroy the man I called grandfather, shatter my father's understanding of his own identity, and expose decades of carefully maintained fiction. The worst part was the isolation. There was no one I could talk to about this discovery without potentially destroying lives. My parents were halfway across the world, blissfully unaware that their romantic getaway would soon be overshadowed by revelations that predated their own love story. My younger brother was only 12, too young to bear this kind of burden. And my grandmother? She had clearly spent a lifetime ensuring this secret stayed buried. But secrets have a way of demanding attention, and as I would soon discover, I wasn't the only one in our family who suspected that our foundation was built on something other than truth. The next morning, I woke with the photograph still clutched in my hand, its edges now soft from my nervous fingers. Grandma Rose was already in the kitchen, humming a tune I didn't recognize while preparing breakfast. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal after my discovery, like I was watching a performance of a life rather than living in it. "You look tired, sweetheart," she said, not turning from the stove. "Did you sleep poorly?" I studied her back, looking for signs of guilt or awareness that her secret had been discovered. But she moved with the same easy grace she always had, cracking eggs and flipping bacon as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis. Either she was an exceptional actress, or she genuinely had no idea that her past had literally surfaced. "Just thinking about things," I replied carefully, taking a seat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten countless meals throughout my childhood. "Dangerous habit for someone your age," she chuckled. "At 16, you should be worrying about boys in school, not whatever's putting those worry lines on your forehead." Her words stung because they highlighted how this discovery had aged me overnight. I was no longer just thinking about summer plans or which college I might attend. I was grappling with questions of identity, deception, and the complex moral landscape of family secrets. Did I have the right to know this truth? Did I have the responsibility to share it? After breakfast, I excused myself to take a walk through Rose's neighborhood. The tree-lined streets and well-maintained gardens had always represented stability and tradition to me. Now they felt like stage sets, beautiful facades hiding unknown stories behind every front door. How many other families were built on foundations of carefully maintained fiction? My walk led me to the local library, where I hoped to find more information about the mysterious James from the photograph. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, had known my grandmother for decades. If anyone might have insights into Rose's past, it would be her. "Sarah, how lovely to see you," Mrs. Henderson beamed as I approached the reference desk. "How are you enjoying your summer with Rose? That woman is a treasure. We're so lucky to have her in our community." "She's amazing," I agreed, then took a calculated risk. "I've been helping her go through old photographs and got curious about our family history. Do you happen to know anything about her life before she married my grandfather?" Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted slightly, a shadow crossing her features so quickly I almost missed it. "Well, dear, that was a long time ago. Your grandmother has been part of our community since the mid-50s, but before that..." She trailed off, seeming to choose her words carefully. People didn't talk as much about their pasts back then, especially if there were painful memories involved. The phrase "painful memories" hit me like a physical blow. Whatever secret Rose was hiding wasn't just about dates and names, it was about pain, loss, and choices that had shaped the trajectory of multiple lives. Mrs. Henderson's careful diplomacy suggested she knew more than she was willing to share, bound by the same code of silence that had protected Rose's secret for decades. "Did she ever mention anyone named James?" I pressed gently. Mrs. Henderson's face went completely still, and for a moment I thought she might not respond at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Sarah, some questions are better asked of the people who lived through the answers. Your grandmother is a good woman who's faced more challenges than most people could handle. If there are things she hasn't shared, perhaps there are good reasons for that." The librarian's words carried a weight that confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't just a simple case of mixed-up dates or forgotten details. James represented something significant, and potentially painful, in Rose's past. The way Mrs. Henderson had reacted suggested that others in the community might know pieces of the story, but they had all agreed to participate in protecting Rose's carefully constructed narrative. I spent the next few hours researching military records and local newspapers from the early 1950s, but found nothing concrete about a James who might have been connected to my grandmother. The absence of information felt deliberate, as if someone had taken great care to erase traces of whatever had happened. As I walked back to Rose's house, I noticed an elderly man working in his garden across the street. He looked up as I passed, and something in his expression gave me pause. There was recognition there, but also a sadness that seemed familiar. It reminded me of the look I'd seen in Rose's eyes the night before, the weight of long-held secrets. "You're Rose's granddaughter," he called out, not really a question. "Sir. I'm Sarah." He nodded slowly, setting down his gardening tools. "You look like her, you know. Like she did when she first came to the neighborhood." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something internal. "That was a different time, child. People did what they had to do to survive, to protect the ones they loved. Sometimes that meant making choices that weren't easy to live with." His words felt like a warning and a plea rolled into one. "Don't dig too deep," they seemed to say. "Some truths are buried for good reasons." But I was already too far down the path to turn back. The photograph in my backpack felt like it was burning through the fabric, demanding attention and action. When I returned to the house, Rose was in her garden, tending to the roses that had always been her pride and joy. Watching her gentle hands work with the thorny stems, I was struck by the metaphor. Beauty that required careful handling, protection from sharp edges that could draw blood if you weren't cautious. "Grandma," I said, settling beside her on the garden bench, "can I ask you something?" She looked up, soil still clinging to her gloves, and smiled. But there was wariness in her eyes now, as if she sensed that whatever question was coming would be different from the usual teenage inquiries about life and love. "Of course, sweetheart. You know you can ask me anything." The irony of those words, considering the secret I now carried, nearly made me laugh. Instead, I pulled out the photograph, my hands shaking slightly as I placed it on the bench between us. The change in Rose's expression was immediate and devastating. All the color drained from her face and her hands began to tremble. For a moment I thought she might faint, and I reached out to steady her. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of wind through the garden. "In the attic, under a loose floorboard." My own voice sounded strange to my ears, formal and careful. "Grandma, who is James?" Rose's silence stretched so long that I began to wonder if she'd heard my question. She stared at the photograph as if it were a ghost-made manifest, her fingers hovering just above the surface without quite touching it. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades. "James was..." She stopped, took a shuddering breath, then started again. "James was the love of my life." The simple statement hit me like a physical blow. Not a friend, or someone I knew long ago, but the love of her life. Which meant that everything I'd believed about Rose and Henry's marriage, about my grandfather being the great love of her life, was another carefully constructed fiction. "But you married Grandpa Henry," I said, struggling to reconcile this revelation with the loving relationship I'd witnessed throughout my childhood. Rose finally picked up the photograph, her fingers tracing the edges where mine had worn them soft. "I did marry Henry, and he was a good man who gave me a life I needed. But James..." She closed her eyes. "James was who I was meant to be with before the world got in the way." "What happened to him?" The question seemed to break something inside her. Rose began to cry, not the gentle tears of an elderly woman remembering lost love, but the raw, painful sobs of someone reliving trauma. I put my arm around her shoulders, immediately regretting my decision to confront her so directly. "He died in Korea," she whispered between sobs. "July 1953. We were going to be married when he came home, but he never came home. And I was pregnant with your father." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. My father wasn't just born before Rose married Henry. He was born to a different man entirely. Henry had raised Tommy as his own son, never knowing that the boy calling him Dad was actually the child of a dead soldier. "Does my father know?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Rose shook her head vehemently. "No one knows. Henry believed Tommy was premature, born early after our marriage. I never told him the truth." She looked at me with desperate eyes. "You can't tell him, Sarah. It would destroy everything. Your father's understanding of who he is, Henry's memory, our entire family. Promise me you won't tell him." The weight of her request pressed down on me like a physical force. She was asking me to become a co-conspirator in a deception that had shaped 3 generations of our family. But she was also asking me to protect people I loved from a truth that would devastate them. "What about Tommy's medical history?" I asked, trying to focus on practical concerns while my emotions reeled. "What if he needs information about his biological father for health reasons?" James was healthy, strong. There was nothing in his family history that would affect Tommy or you children. Rose's voice had taken on a desperate edge. "Please, Sarah. I've carried this secret for 66 years. I'm 87 years old. Can't it die with me?" But even as she pleaded, I could see the relief in her eyes at finally sharing her burden with someone. The isolation of carrying such a massive secret alone must have been crushing, and part of her seemed grateful that she no longer had to bear it entirely by herself. "What was he like?" I found myself asking. "James." Rose's expression softened, and for a moment, I could see the young woman she'd been in the photograph. "He was everything, Sarah. Funny and kind and brave. He wrote me letters every day from training camp and later from Korea. I saved every single one." She paused, seeming to make a decision. "Would you like to see them?" Against my better judgment, I nodded. Rose led me back into the house and up to her bedroom, where she opened a cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper and tied with a blue ribbon, were dozens of letters. The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink was still dark and clear. My dearest Rose, I read from the top letter. I dream of you every night and wake up missing you more than I thought possible. 3 more months until I'm home and we can start our life together. I've been thinking about names for the baby. What do you think of James Jr. if it's a boy? Or maybe Thomas after my grandfather? Thomas. My father was named after James's grandfather, carrying the legacy of a man he'd never known existed. The interconnectedness of it all made my head spin. He knew about the baby? I asked. Oh yes. He was so excited to be a father. He had plans for everything. The house we'd buy, the job he'd take with his uncle's construction company, how he'd teach our son to play baseball. Rose's voice broke again. He died 2 weeks before Tommy was born, never knowing he had a son. The tragedy of it overwhelmed me. James had died believing he would come home to marry Rose and raise their child. Rose had faced single motherhood in 1953, when being an unwed mother carried enormous social stigma. And my father had grown up never knowing his real father's dreams for him. How did you manage? Being pregnant and unmarried in the 50s. I moved away for the pregnancy, told people here that I was caring for a sick relative in another state. Henry knew me from before, we'd gone to high school together. And when I came back with Tommy, I told him I'd been married briefly to a soldier who died in Korea, but that the marriage records had been lost in a fire. It wasn't entirely a lie. The sophistication of her deception was staggering. She'd constructed an entire alternative history, complete with plausible explanations for missing documentation. But she'd also found a way to honor James's memory, even if only she knew she was doing it. Henry fell in love with both Tommy and me, Rose continued. He proposed 6 months after I returned, said he wanted to give us both a name and a future. I convinced him to adopt Tommy legally to give him a fresh start. Henry was so good to us, Sarah. He never once treated Tommy as anything other than his own son. I found myself crying now too, overwhelmed by the complexity of love and loss and sacrifice that had shaped my family's story. Rose had made impossible choices in impossible circumstances, creating a foundation of love built on a framework of necessary lies. But the weight of the secret was now partially mine to bear, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough to carry it. Every time I looked at my father going forward, I would see James in his features. Every story about Henry and Rose's early marriage would feel like a performance I was forced to watch, knowing the truth behind the fiction. What am I supposed to do with this? I asked, gesturing to the letters in the photograph. Rose took my hands in hers, her skin paper-thin but her grip surprisingly strong. You're supposed to love your family, Sarah. All of them, James, who gave us Tommy, Henry, who gave us stability and respectability, and Tommy, who deserves to live his life without having his foundation shattered. But love, I was learning, was far more complicated than I'd ever imagined. The following days passed in a surreal haze. I found myself studying every family photograph with new eyes, looking for traces of James in my father's features, in my own reflection. The resemblance was undeniable once I knew what to look for. The shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw, even the way we both tilted our heads when thinking deeply about something. Rose and I had entered into an uncomfortable partnership of silence, bound together by knowledge that felt too heavy for either of us to carry alone. She seemed both relieved and terrified that her secret was no longer entirely her own. I caught her watching me sometimes, as if trying to gauge whether I would keep my promise or if the burden would prove too much for someone my age. The arrival of a phone call on Thursday morning changed everything. "Sarah, sweetheart, it's Mom." My mother's voice sounded strange, tighter than usual. "I need to talk to Grandma Rose. Is she there?" I handed the phone to Rose, watching her face change as she listened. Her complexion went ashen, and she sank into her kitchen chair as if her legs could no longer support her. "Yes, Linda, I understand. Of course. We'll be there as soon as we can book a flight." When she hung up, Rose's hands were shaking so violently she could barely replace the receiver. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. "Your father had a heart attack in Rome. He's alive, but..." He paused, struggling to maintain composure. "He needs surgery and the doctors are asking about his family medical history. They need to know about any hereditary heart conditions, any genetic factors that might affect his treatment. The irony was cruel and immediate. After 66 years of successfully hiding the truth about Tommy's parentage, medical necessity was about to force the secret into the open. The doctors would need accurate information about James's health history, not Henry's, to properly treat my father. "What are we going to do?" I whispered. Rose was quiet for so long I thought she hadn't heard me. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a resignation that broke my heart. "We're going to tell him the truth. If it might save his life, we have to tell him." The flight to Rome was the longest 8 hours of my life. Rose seemed to age years during the journey, the weight of her impending confession visible in every line of her face. She spent most of the flight staring out the window, occasionally pulling out James's letters to read them one more time before her secret life became public knowledge. "Are you scared?" I asked as we began our descent into Rome. "Terrified," she admitted. "Not just of telling Tommy, but of how it might change how you see me. I've been Saint Rose in your eyes for 16 years. The grandmother who never did anything wrong, who had the perfect marriage, who always made the right choices. Now you know I'm just a person who made impossible decisions in impossible circumstances." Her vulnerability in that moment made me love her more, not less. "You're still Saint Rose to me," I said, taking her hand. "Maybe even more so, knowing what you survived and how you protected everyone you loved." We arrived at the hospital to find my parents in the cardiac unit, my mother red-eyed from crying and my father looking smaller than I'd ever seen him in his hospital bed. The monitors surrounding him beeped steadily, electronic proof that his heart was still fighting. "Mom, thank God you're here," my father said weakly as Rose approached his bed. "The doctors keep asking about Dad's side of the family, any heart problems, genetic conditions, that sort of thing." I told them Dad lived to be 92 with no major health issues, but they want more detailed information. Rose looked at me, then back at her son, the child she'd protected with lies for his entire life. "Tommy, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago, but I was trying to protect you." My father's expression shifted, some instinct warning him that whatever was coming would be significant. "What is it, Mom?" "Henry wasn't your biological father." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. My mother gasped, and my father's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then a strange kind of recognition, as if some part of him had always sensed that something didn't quite fit. "What do you mean?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand exactly what she meant. Rose pulled out the photograph I'd found in the attic, now worn even softer from her nervous handling during the flight. "This is your real father. His name was James Morrison, and he died in Korea 2 weeks before you were born." My father stared at the photograph for a long time, and I watched as he processed not just the information but the implications of it. His entire identity, his understanding of his own genetics, his relationship with the man he'd called Dad for 55 years, all of it was shifting and realigning in real time. "You lied to me for my entire life," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I protected you," Rose replied firmly. "And I loved you. And Henry loved you. Nothing about that was a lie." The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of the monitors. My mother reached for my father's hand, and I could see her trying to process this revelation alongside her fear for his health. The timing was horrible, but the necessity was undeniable. "The doctors need to know about James's medical history," Rose continued, pulling out a folder she'd prepared during the flight. "I saved everything. His military medical records, information about his family's health history. His grandfather Thomas, who you were named after, lived to be 96 with no heart problems. James was in perfect health when he enlisted." Dr. Martinelli, my father's cardiologist, entered the room at that moment and immediately sensed the tension. Rose handed him the folder, explaining the situation with admirable directness. The doctor reviewed the documents, asking clarifying questions about dates and family history that only Rose could answer. "This actually changes our approach significantly," Dr. Martinelli said after reviewing everything. "Based on this genetic history, we can use a less invasive procedure with better long-term outcomes. This information may very well save your son's life." Rose closed her eyes and I could see her shoulders relax slightly. The secret that had burdened her for 66 years had finally served its purpose, protecting the child she'd carried alone through an impossible time. But as my father continued to stare at the photograph of the man who'd given him life, I realized that while one crisis was resolving, another was just beginning. The foundation of our family had shifted, and none of us yet understood what that would mean for our future. 3 months later, I sat in Rose's garden watching her tend to her roses with the same gentle care she'd always shown them. My father had made a full recovery from his surgery, but the emotional healing for our family had proven more complex and ongoing. The truth about James had created ripples that extended far beyond just my father's identity. My mother had struggled initially with feeling like their entire marriage had been built on a foundation she hadn't fully understood. My father had gone through stages of anger, grief, and eventually a kind of wondering acceptance as he processed having a biological father he'd never known existed. But perhaps the most surprising development had been the healing that began once the secret was finally out in the open. "I've been thinking about visiting James's grave," my father said, joining Rose and me in the garden. He'd been saying this for weeks but hadn't yet made the trip to the military cemetery where James was buried. "I think I need to meet him somehow." Rose looked up from her roses, soil still clinging to her gloves. "I think he'd like that. I think he'd be proud of the man you became. Even though I became that man because of Henry's influence, not his?" This was the heart of my father's struggle. Reconciling love for the father who'd raised him with curiosity about the father who'd created him. Rose had been patient with his questions, sharing stories about James while emphasizing that Henry's love and guidance had been no less real or valuable. "James gave you life, Tommy. Henry gave you everything else. Your values, your work ethic, your terrible jokes." Rose smiled. "You're the product of both their love, even though James never got the chance to show his directly." I pulled out my phone and showed them the email I'd received that morning. "I found James's nephew online. He's been researching family history and would love to meet us. He said James used to talk about Rose and the baby he was hoping to come home to." My father's face lit up with an expression I'd never seen before, eager anticipation mixed with nervous energy. For the first time since learning the truth, he seemed genuinely excited rather than just processing difficult information. "He has James's letters to his family," I continued. "Letters where he talks about you, Dad, before you were even born. About how he wanted to teach you to fish and play baseball." Rose began crying, not the painful tears of the past few months, but something closer to relief. "He wrote to me about those same dreams. Said he couldn't wait to show our son how to bait a hook and throw a curveball. Henry taught me those things instead," my father said softly. "Maybe that's how it was supposed to be. James gave me the dream and Henry made it reality." This perspective, that both men had contributed to who my father had become, had slowly emerged as our family's way of processing the revelation. Rather than seeing it as a betrayal or replacement, we'd begun to understand it as a more complex story of love and sacrifice involving multiple generations. My mother had eventually embraced this narrative as well. "I fell in love with who you are, not who your biological father was," she told my dad during one of their long conversations about the revelation. "James gave you your smile and your stubbornness. Henry gave you your kindness and your terrible dancing. I love all of it." The integration hadn't been without challenges. My father had gone through a period of questioning every childhood memory, wondering what was real and what was built on the fiction Rose had created. But gradually he'd come to understand that love and family weren't diminished by complex origins. "I want to take you with me," he said now, looking at Rose. "To visit James's grave. I think he'd want to know that you're okay, that the baby he worried about turned out fine." Rose nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her gardening glove, leaving a streak of soil across her cheek. "I'd like that. I haven't been able to visit him since the funeral. I was too afraid someone would ask questions I couldn't answer." As I watched these two people I loved navigate their shared grief and healing, I realized something profound about secrets and truth. The secret hadn't just protected Rose and my father. It had also deprived them of the ability to properly mourn James together, to honor his memory, to share stories about the man who'd shaped their lives even in his absence. "There's something else," I said, pulling out a folder I'd been carrying for weeks. "I've been working on a project for school about family history, but it became something more. I interviewed Rose about James, researched his military service, even found some of his friends who are still alive. I handed them a bound manuscript, a complete account of James Morrison's life, his love story with Rose, and his dreams for the son he'd never meet. I'd included copies of his letters, photographs from his military service, and testimonials from people who'd known him. I wanted to make sure his story wasn't lost, I explained. That there was a record of who he was and what he meant to our family. And I wanted you to have something concrete about your biological father, Dad. Not just the absence where he should have been, but the actual person he was. My father flipped through the pages, stopping at a section where I'd transcribed James's letters about his hopes and dreams for fatherhood. His eyes filled with tears as he read his biological father's words about wanting to be the kind of dad who was present and engaged, who would prioritize family above everything else. He sounds like he would have been a lot like Henry, my father said finally. Maybe that's why Rose fell in love with both of them, I suggested. Rose looked up from her own copy of the manuscript, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely at peace. The burden she'd carried alone for 66 years was finally shared, transformed from a secret that isolated her into a story that connected us all more deeply. You know what I realized, she said, addressing both my father and me. I spent so many years afraid that the truth would destroy our family. But keeping the secret was what was slowly destroying me. The truth, difficult as it was, set us all free. As the sun began to set over Rose's garden, painting the roses in shades of gold and amber, I reflected on everything that had changed since that afternoon in her attic. I'd started the summer as a typical 16-year-old, concerned with ordinary teenage problems. I was ending it as someone who understood that families are complex ecosystems built on love, sacrifice, and sometimes necessary compromises with truth. The photograph that had started it all now sat in a place of honor on Rose's mantel, no longer hidden but celebrated. James Morrison had finally come home to his family, not in the way he'd planned, but in the way we needed him to. His love had survived death, secrecy, and the passage of time to finally find its place in our story. And I'd learned that being the sister who knew too much wasn't about the burden of keeping secrets. It was about the responsibility of helping truth find its way into the light, gently and with love, when the time was finally right. The knowledge that had threatened to destroy generations of silence had instead become the foundation for a deeper, more honest kind of love. Sometimes the most dangerous truths are also the most necessary ones.